Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of our special lectures of SSER Ideas Lectures on the COVID-19 pandemic and the implications for the economy. Today, we're absolutely delighted to have a very eminent and exciting panel, which is going to be looking at the issues in South Africa. And we have a very fascinating mix of speakers, actually. We have economists, activists, lawyers, and I think it's going to be a very wide-ranging and interesting discussion. We have Fiona Tregenna. She is the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development at the University of Johannesburg. And she has a very, very impressive background, as well as recent experience. She's been on a whole range of committees for the government of South Africa and in many, many advisory capacities, has been very active in the African Program for Rethinking Development Economics, a member of many of the research bodies of South Africa, as well as policy advisory groups, and eminently qualified, I think, to talk about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy, as well as the government's attempts to deal with it. Gilad Isaacs is a co-director at the Institute of Economic Justice. I, of course, met him first when he was at Wits University, where he still coordinates the National Minimum Wage Research Initiative. He is also very active in a range of different activities in South Africa, including running the Global Labour University in South Africa and a number of other things. And I think will provide a very interesting perspective. Zukiswa Kota is the head of monitoring and advocacy at the Public Service Accountability Monitor and steering committee chair of the Budget Justice Coalition. She is a Rhodes University graduate in environmental sciences, and she is very active in promoting social justice and looking especially at environmental issues. Nurina Ali is a lawyer, and she's also an activist lawyer, which is the best kind, I believe, who has got her degree from the University of Witwatersrand and then as well from Edinburgh, and currently practices as a senior associate in law and has served at the Constitutional Court of South Africa as well. So I think this is a very varied group, as you can see, but also very relevant to the topic at hand. So I'm going to request Fiona to start with about 10 minutes of just talking about what you see as the current situation.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Jarati. Thanks for inviting us to speak on the issue of South Africa in this really interesting seminar series that Ideas has been running. So I'm just going to make a quite brief introduction and overview to the development of the pandemic in South Africa and the response, the policy response. And then I'm going to hand over to Gilad, who's going to focus on the macro side. Zuki focusing mainly on governance, perhaps a bit on budgets as well, and Nurina is going to talk about education. So in terms of the introduction of the pandemic to South Africa, it came really, as I think in a number of other developing countries, through the globalized elite in South Africa, the middle and upper professional classes who were returning to South Africa from mainly from Europe, later a few cases from the US. We had very little to no transmission from China. Our initial cases here were from a group that had returned from a skiing holiday in Italy. And this was followed by other cases which were being imported from Germany, Austria, France, and so on. So we had an initial bump in the infections, followed by a decline until community transmission set in. Perhaps, Vikas, if you don't mind, if you could put up the first of those charts, which is on the cases. So I'm just going to show two charts here for people who are not so familiar with the South African development. So here I've just pulled up, for comparison purposes, South Africa, which is the orange line, with a couple of other developing countries. You'll see there India, Brazil, Turkey, as well as some of the other OECD countries, just for comparison purposes. So you'll see South Africa has a quite unique path in the trajectory. And even if we include more countries in this, it's still quite a unique trajectory. So it had a very steep initial increase. You can see the orange line going up very steeply at first, in fact, following a very similar path to the UK initially. And then a turning point and a decline. This is a log scale of and it's a 7-day rolling average of confirmed cases. So obviously this is not including tested cases. So this decline seems to be attributable mainly to strict social distancing measures which were introduced even before the lockdown. So South Africa, like India, had a very early lockdown. In fact, before even the first death. The first death came coincidentally on the first day when the lockdown had already been implemented. So it came at a much earlier stage than in other countries. And particularly that social distancing measures that preceded the lockdown, as well as the subsequent lockdown, seemed to have really bent the curve. So we probably would have followed a similar trajectory perhaps to UK or other countries, and went down. But as you can see, the cases have been since going up, and this is during the lockdown period. So we are still in lockdown, although it has been relaxed, it has been eased a bit recently, but we're still in the lockdown. Maybe Vikas, you can just show the second chart, which is on deaths. I'll just show this very briefly. So our deaths are still relatively low, but definitely on an upward trend. I think that is fine for the graphs. Thanks, Vikas. Yeah. So I mean, I think in common with a number of other developing countries, in South Africa, the health infrastructure is already poor, and hospitals were already under strain before this epidemic. Shortage of medical personnel, poor hospital infrastructure, lack of equipment, and so on, as well as comorbidities. So our very high rate of HIV/AIDS, associated illnesses like TB, and so on. I think the evidence is still emerging on the effects of HIV as a comorbidity, and the differences being of people who are and are not on ARV treatment. Also relevant in terms of medical and social conditions is the dense living conditions of the working class. And in many cases, lack of running water, people living in close proximity, and so on, which makes social distancing very difficult to impossible to implement in practice. And as well as linked to this, the lack of alternative income generating opportunities for people during a period of lockdown. Yeah, at the sorry. Yeah, I think, I mean, more broadly, as in many countries, the COVID crisis really draws attention to the unevenness, the extreme unevenness in South Africa in terms of the effects of the pandemic and the extent to which people can cope with it and are likely to be affected by it in the short, medium, and long term. So the unevenness by class, by gender, spatially, and so on. I think there has been quite a bit of opposition to the lockdown for various reasons. Middle class and upper class people kind of annoyed that they can't go around their daily lives as before and enjoy all of the privileges. Working class people who practically cannot lock down in a shack in an informal settlement, and so on. And probably, especially in recent times, we've seen a kind of a growing authoritarianism in some of the ways in which the lockdown has been implemented. Nowhere like the stage of India, I would say, but more in terms of like the pettiness of regulations and heavy-handed implementation, which I think also affects, the extent to which there's a broad social buy-in to the lockdown. But I think it's clear that had there not been the social distancing and the lockdown, by now we would have seen tens of thousands of deaths. That much is clear. But the sustainability of it has become very difficult. So the situation which South Africa now finds ourselves in is that we're easing the lockdown at the time when our cases are exponentially increasing. So we're at the beginning of the exponential increase in the curve, and yet we are easing the lockdown because it's seen as not sustainable. So we implemented it very early and probably prevented a number of deaths. But now, unlike other countries who lifted the lockdown when they'd already passed the peak and had infections more or less under control, in our case, we're lifting it while we're going up in the curve. So the expectation here is that things will be very bad over the next few months, and it will be difficult to implement further hard lockdowns. But that other measures will have to be implemented. But I think the expectation is that it will be pretty bad. In terms of the economic response, I'm just going to really introduce it very briefly before handing over to Gilad. I mean, I think there have been various legs of the economic policy response from government in terms of immediate short-term relief, in terms of cutting of interest rates, in terms of support for small businesses and so on. I mean, clearly it's nowhere near adequate, and I say that as somebody who's been involved in developing that policy response. Clearly, it's nowhere near adequate, particularly given the economic situation that South Africa was in before all of this. So, as we know, very low and stagnant growth in South Africa, and what we refer to as the triple challenges of extremely high unemployment, either the highest or almost the highest in the world, depending on data. Extremely high inequality and poverty. So the danger, I think, is that firms which close or people who lose their jobs during this period, a short-term immediate impact might become a long-term structural impact. So someone who loses their job now, obviously depending on the nature of the person and their skills and experience and so on, but someone who loses their job may never work again. A firm that closes may never open again. So the danger is that a temporary unemployment shock, which is forecast that it might go up to around 50%, could actually become a structural increase in unemployment, not to the same level, but part of it might become a long-term structural increase in unemployment. So from that perspective, the case for a far more robust and extensive economic support package is very clear. That even if you have to borrow money, as well as tapping in far more extensively to the domestic resources that are there, would be money well spent in terms of saving of firms, saving of jobs, mitigating the long-term impact on the life prospects of children and so on. So let me leave it there and hand over to the go into more detail in particular areas, and then perhaps come back later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fiona. I've turned my video off because my internet connection is weak. So I'm going to be invisible, but I'm present. So thanks very much for this very quick and good overview. And so over to Gilad. Gilad, you have to unmute yourself. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Jati. And thanks for the invitation. Our institute has been very involved in proposing various policy solutions, and I'm going to do some level of analysis of what's been put forward and what that might mean against what it should be. Just to say, Jati, it's poor form to correct a chairperson, but my colleagues might be upset if I don't. I haven't run the Global Labour University. I have contributed and been a consultant there. So I just wanted to.
Sorry, I take it
make
back. You're
that clear.
co-conspirator. You're
Yes,
co-conspirator
yes.
in the Global Labour University. Okay.
Amongst very amongst other conspiratorial endeavors. So I want to just, given the ideas audience, think about this and try situate what I'm going to present a little bit analytically within an understanding of South African neoliberalism, and really within an understanding of how that's played out over the last 25 years, with a tension between progressive or interventionist economic policies and market-centric policies. And of course, this is true of neoliberalism everywhere, not being a monolithic regime, but has particular features in South Africa and reflects really a few contradictions and contestations. At the heart of the ruling ANC is various factions which hold divergent economic and ideological views, some with a far more social democratic, like socialist, interventionist like viewpoint, and those with neoliberal laissez-faire viewpoint. In addition, you've got the tensions between the established monopoly economic elite and various new business interests, and then of course also large-scale corruption. And whilst these may seem distant from the specifics of what we're seeing now, these internal inconsistencies actually are very important in understanding the incoherent policy response which we've seen. Like in many countries, despite these internal incoherencies, the various boundaries of what is policed as legitimate economic policy is done so by the core economic centers of the National Treasury and our Reserve Bank. And despite the fact that the COVID-19 period has disrupted many of the orthodoxies which exist, it hasn't displaced this economic power. And it's within that context to understand policies. I'm also going to share my screen here for a second, and I'll flip back between myself and a few of these PowerPoint slides. Unless I'm interrupted by anyone, I'm going to assume that that's clear. What I want to show you is where South Africa stood in its fiscal response prior to the announcement of an emergency package. So this graph is from April 2nd. You can, this is true throughout the first 3.5 weeks of our lockdown. So despite the fact that we had one of the strictest lockdowns globally, our economic stimulus was at 0.1% in comparison with a G20 average of about 10%, and below that in both advanced and in developing countries, including those in Africa, which have significantly less resources than South Africa. An emergency package was announced, and according to the Treasury, this brought South Africa's spending up to about 10% of our GDP. I'm going to unpack why I think this is false, but it's important to say and to add to what Fiona said. This is in a context of a projected fall in GDP of about 10% in the economy, and upwards of 1 million job losses, which could be significantly higher as indicated. So despite a significant fall, we had responded with an extremely low level of intervention. The nature of the intervention announced very late is in front of you now, and shows various main centers of expenditure. Expenditure in health, in municipalities, that's mainly in sanitation, water, housing services, an increase in social grants, an increase in job support, which we still don't know what that means, and a wage guarantee scheme, which helps companies pay wages. In addition to that spending, we see that there is various loan guarantees and deferrals in tax and in payments, but that's so far overwhelmingly applies to corporates and not households. And in US dollar terms, this adds up to around 27 billion US dollars. The financing of this, although it seems like a fair amount, if you consider the fact that the loans and deferrals aren't actually new spending in the economy, then you only have a 230 billion in actual spending. Over half comes from the existing budget. So it is drawing funds from elsewhere to spend here. 60 billion is from Social Security funds, 15 billion from the Department of Social Development, leaving only 65 billion in new spending, which is really not going to serve as any meaningful stimulus in the economy. When we think, and I'm going to skip through this, we did an input to presidency where we tried to argue that you need to think about stimulus in various ways, which is go early or go hard, or large, go household, go simple, go survival, and then also target these things in various ways to improve the domestic production, employment, impact, important regions, and long-term benefit to the economy. I don't know if Ideas has the ability to make these slides available, but I can share them because I'm not going to spend huge amounts of time on this. And essentially,
yes, that's wonderful. We will make them available, Gilad. So please, that's great. Yes.
Excellent. Thanks, Jati. So essentially, on all of these, South Africa went late. On almost all of them, it is too small. I think Zuki and Nurina will unpack some of the social grant issues, but South Africa has tied itself in knots to try and limit the number of people to access Social Security. On the wage guarantees, which is terse here, they've made it almost impossible to access. So far, about 125,000 employers have accessed that. That's around 5% of employers in South Africa. 94% of small businesses say that they either now do or will face a cash flow crisis. And yet you have a paltry number of businesses and employers who have managed to access wage support. Despite the low access, it's actually used up a quarter of the available funds, which indicates, as we argued much earlier, that it's both insufficient funds and completely inefficient and inaccessible. So what we have on the fiscal side is quite interesting, because what you've seen is a eventual caving to demands from civil society activists, economists, business leaders, unionists, and an acquiescence to emergency measures, but at the same time, this clawing back of those, both in terms of ensuring that there's extremely small new funds being injected, and in a limiting of actual access to the measures which are allegedly being put in place. And that speaks to this contradiction at the heart of policy making. I'm aware that I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to show one more slide, which looks at monetary policy responses, which have again been forced upon the Reserve Bank and others extremely slow to act. There has been a reduction in interest rates on 2 occasions. There's been some bond buying in the secondary markets, but there's been no primary market bond buying, no conversation of capital controls in any meaningful sense, no asset purchases from any companies in distress, sorry, I stutter sometimes, and no developmental lending to development banks or elsewhere. Not only that, but it has the Reserve Bank has tried rhetorically to argue that it's not actually doing the things which it is doing, and to sort of color them in other ways. So I think I've made it clear that the thesis here is that we've been facing a significant lockdown. We've had a very weak economic response, that the orthodoxies which exist have been disrupted but not unseated, and yet the traditional centers of economic power have successfully been forced to undertake measures which they weren't in favor of originally. And that does indicate that there is room for ongoing challenge. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Gilad. That was fascinating. I'm trying to make myself visible. Yes, I managed. Yes, that was fascinating also because such depressing similarities to India. We thought we were particularly bad because our Prime Minister just announced a 10 percentage point of GDP fiscal stimulus, and it turns out that there's no fiscal in it. There's no new spending. And in fact, what they're calling spending is giving people back their income tax rebates rather than, which they are supposed to get anyway, rather than new spending. Absolutely. So maybe this is a common problem in emerging markets, and we'll have to come back to that discussion. But I'm going to now ask Zukiswa to tell us about what it looks like from her perspective. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jyoti. I think I'll share my screen straight off. And also just to say that I I will keep a timer because I'm notoriously bad with brevity. But also, if you could, if
Yes,
really
don't
time becomes
worry.
an issue.
I'll remind you. I'll remind you. Don't
Great.
worry.
So yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'll get right into the presentation. And some of the perspectives really are using a lens that we use or tend to use at the Public Service Accountability Monitor, that is oriented around principles of social accountability, especially when we look at governance and when we consider issues of resourcing. So I think to be as brief as I can, I won't really look at the budget context, and I think from the macro perspective, Gilad and Fiona have done an excellent job. So I think we're covered on that front. What I did want to start off on maybe is just that I found Gilad's overview quite helpful, and one of the things in the context of what I'll focus on is just that I quite liked the go simple aspect of the matrix you shared, and the kind of targeting of areas. So I'll be looking quite a lot, or specifically focusing on issues of governance within a municipal space or within municipalities, and the COVID-19 response, just to try and keep it quite tight and confined. But some of the, at the end, I'll touch on some of the broader areas relating to governance concerns. So this I think I'll skip over, except to just touch on that last line in the slide, which talks about in terms of disaster management responses and what has been provided for in by law and by the presidential announcements, is the provisions for oversight. Initially, we were concerned, and several organizations were concerned, about the lack of clarity around what oversight would be provided over the kinds of responses, both from a fiscal and financing perspective, as well as from a service delivery and human rights perspective. I mean, those are interconnected. But Parliament initially had said, well, they were closed, and that, in fact, monitoring the work of the executive wouldn't be as possible as it was in the past. Many activists came together, and a range of engagements have brought about, I think, what has been meaningful change. And we've got virtual monitoring, virtual work being done remotely, rather, by parliamentary committees in the legislature. And we'll talk at the end about why that's particularly pertinent. This I'm happy to skip over because I think we've touched on it. So perhaps just to really start off with what it is I'll be, what it is I'm couching governance in, or what really governance is. And so simply, it's the context in which the state and citizens engage, the relationships that are within that space, but also the extent of relationships between civic actors, which has become really important in terms of responses to COVID-19, not only in South Africa, but as we've seen around the world. Governance relations, governance networks and dynamics are fundamental, and the power that's exercised within those is also really important. I think both Fiona and Gilad have touched on aspects of that. So it's also, what we're seeing is that, as with any governance discussion, it's different context to context, changes over time, and it can be, governance systems can be as basic as merely delivering the bare minimum to being able to engage and have interconnectedness and communication between governments and citizens, to more transformative contexts in which those relationships actually ultimately result in change or transformation, or ensuring that democratic governance works better for people, which ultimately is really what we're concerned about. So just briefly, broadly, in the context of the South African Constitution, there is the mandate to progressively realize within available resources a range of rights. And we're looking roughly at a population of about 58 million people as at some point last year. And the Constitution also says, or provides and makes sure, that public administration has to be governed by these democratic principles, that people's needs have to be responded to, people must be encouraged to participate in policy making. And again, that becomes quite pertinent in the context of COVID-19. The Constitution also obliges the administration to be transparent, to provide the public with timely, accessible, and accurate information, again, underscoring that in the context of COVID-19. So again, in South Africa, just a snapshot, we're looking at 9 provincial subnational divisions and about 278 local level or municipalities. And within that, we have 8 metros, and one of these aspects might have changed, but 8 metros, roughly 44 district municipalities and 226 local municipalities. So there is some complexity in relation to the governance structures and the interconnectedness. As soon as we start to talk about policy making that is responsive to the needs of the people, as soon as we start to talk about the inequality and the extreme inequality that Fiona was talking about earlier, and as soon as we begin to try to understand what issues like procurement and the delivery of services begins to look like or needs to look like. So quick glance at the time. Maybe just also to say that from where I sit in our organization, we define social accountability as a right. So we couch the right of civic actors to, on the one hand, demand explanations for the use of resources, on the other, to receive and obtain those, but also that citizens have a right to demand corrective action when the state fails to provide services adequately. We see that as a fundamental right and an enabling right. So what does that mean? I won't look at this, except that the interconnectedness of public resource management systems is also really important to consider when we want to assess the extent to which the state is responding adequately or is responding at all when we talk about a disaster context like COVID-19. So I chose to look specifically at the municipal space because of the complexity I've mentioned, but also because of time. So in South Africa, we had this, as Fiona mentioned, I think the Disaster Management Act, which was, really the policy or legislated for response. And more recently, regulations then give centralized command control to a National Disaster Water Command Center. I focused on water and municipalities because that is one of the areas where we see some of the issues and problems that Gilad touched on. So municipalities, these 270 odd entities, have been told or directed to provide water and sanitation services, particularly in informal settlements with high density suburbs, high density areas, including rural communities. But as we've noted, South Africa is also sitting with a fundamental problem when it comes to adequate infrastructure and appropriate infrastructure, especially in the municipal space. So the Department of Water and Sanitation, where there isn't adequate or appropriate infrastructure to meet these needs in the context of COVID-19, the relevant amendments or relevant regulations have been amended to allow for emergency procurement. And this includes sanitation packs, it includes sinking of boreholes, delivery of water tanks, installation of taps, standpipes, and toilets. And I think it shouldn't be a context in which the need to install ablution facilities and toilets in communities is a response to an emergency or a disaster. But that's where we are in South Africa. And I'm also acutely aware of the context of India as well in that regard. So there's this demand or this expectation to fulfill this right to water and access to clean, reliable services. But less than 50% of South Africa is estimated to have piped water in the home, and access to water within the property sits at about 26%, 27%, and a significant majority or significant proportion of communities have to share communal taps. So walk into a neighborhood, outside of the confines of your home to find water and to access water services. So yes, so there's a sense of a rapid response, and the Water and Sanitation Department has indicated as much, but this response was always required. And so in the context of governance and in those relationships, this is something that is a fundamental failure and shortcoming. So where Gilad highlights in his matrix this the go simple and the targeted nature I think it's important that on the one hand, the response in the municipal context was certainly not early. There are municipalities and communities still now who do not have a response about when water is coming, what water is delivered where, and so on. And also there isn't, there is a barely go hard response, using, again, borrowing a lot from you, Gilad. I found it really useful. And then at this point, inadequate targeting of households in need and in terms of the response. Won't look at that. Perhaps that, later, these are just some of the kind of headlines that we're looking at in relation to governance and responses to water. We have significant issues of corruption and maladministration. We have huge incapacity or capacity issues at the municipal level in terms of just basic delivery of services. And so when COVID-19 is upon us, those are all exacerbated. We also have a range of procurement issues. So, for example,
Zukiswa, can we sort of wrap up now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'll end off on this, which is that we're faced at the moment with irregular contracts within the Department of Water and Sanitation of about 7 billion rand, which equates to 378 million US dollars, and also significant amounts of irregular expenditure and really weak supply chain management and procurement management. So holistically, looking at the context of governance and looking at the context of delivery, in particular at the municipal level and in relation to water, it's really just easy to see that we are in trouble. I can share, when we have a kind of discussion space, some of the key recommendations that we've made, both in terms of our organization and within other coalitions like the Budget Justice Coalition. But I'll end there for now.
Thank you so much, Zuki. So that was very interesting. And again, unfortunate parallels with India. I think we're even worse than you are, but it's interesting to see how many of these problems are shared across the developing world, I think. And the issues you raised about water and the expectation that you can easily handle all of those and do all of the things that are required to maintain proper containment, I think are very important issues. Okay, so now let's go on to Nurina. And Nurina, if you're going to take over. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks. And thanks very much for the invitation. This has been really fascinating so far. So just by way of introduction, as is mentioned, I'm a lawyer, one of the not so bad types, I think, as an activist lawyer. I work at an organization called Equal Education Law Center. I'm the director, and the objective of the Equal Education Law Center is to use law and legal advocacy to advance the right to education in South Africa. But I do need to say I'm not an education expert. I am focused on the legal aspects of education law and policy. So by way of broad background, in South Africa, there are approximately 13 million children who attend around 24,000 public schools across the country. And these schools serve as critical sites not only for teaching and learning, but also for access to other services that are essential for the holistic development of children. And this is significant because schools were actually the first public institutions that closed in response to confirmed cases of COVID-19 in South Africa. And that was been since the 18th of March, which was just over 7 weeks ago, and was actually before the formal national lockdown came into place. And at present, the most critical issue is the proposed dates for the reopening of schools. And that is causing a lot of anxiety across school communities and school stakeholders. And it's causing anxiety both in the case of schools reopen and questions about the safety of children if they're going back to school, and also if schools remain closed, as people are concerned about children's access to basic education, the fact that the caregivers are going back to work and what will be put in place for them. And at present, it seems as if the government is leaning towards a phased reopening of schools, with some grades returning in June and others returning after. But it's wholly unclear at this point, and we're in fact waiting on tenterhooks because the Minister of Basic Education is meant to make an announcement tomorrow. but at this stage, it's still a bit uncertain. So there really are a complex array of issues relating to education and the pandemic, and I can't get into all of those here. But the key point I want to try and convey today is how the pandemic is re-highlighting existing inequalities in the education system, and also how it is exacerbating those inequalities due to new challenges arising. And the context here is that South Africa's public schooling system is highly unequal. Even though there have been some strides since the end of apartheid, put simply, schools in more affluent, wealthier areas, mostly in urban contexts, are generally better resourced and better performing than the schools in poor townships or in rural areas. And we really see how this is now playing out in relation to the pandemic. So I want to touch on briefly just 3 issues which have emerged over this period, and they're certainly not a closed list, but just for the purposes of touching on a few points. The first is access to curriculum resources when schools are closed. So as I've said, schools have been closed now for almost 2 months. And in this period, there have been online resources that have been provided by the government. And also quite progressively, there have been requirements placed on network providers to zero rate some of that content. However, the accessibility to online resources is very skewed. Only around 10% of households have access to internet at home. And in rural areas, that's just under 2%. Mobile internet access takes that up to around 60% across households, but it's not really clear that that actually translates into effective internet access for learning purposes. So to the government's credit, there has been TV and radio lessons that have been broadcast across grades, but in the absence of effective teacher engagement and taking into account the circumstances that Fiona highlighted of overcrowded living conditions, limited access to electricity and other resources, this is by no means a sufficient replacement for teaching and learning in the normal course. And perhaps what's most concerning is that there hasn't really been comprehensive plans that have been provided on how the government intends to mitigate this. So on the one hand, we have well-resourced households that are able to access really good online, or at least some online learning material and resources, able to keep children stimulated in this period. But this is not the position for the vast majority of children in the country. So what we really see is a deepening of that crisis of inequality in access to teaching and learning for poor and vulnerable children. The second issue I want to touch on is the issue of children and access to nutrition. It's not an overstatement to say that we have a emerging hunger crisis in this country. And almost 9 million children in the normal course would receive at least 1 meal a day at South African schools. And in some cases, that would have been the only guaranteed meal that that child would have received. When schools were closed, the school feeding programs were halted across the country except in one province, and they still have not been reactivated. Now, as Gilad mentioned, the government has put in place some social relief measures, which has included an increase to the child support grant. Initially, when that increase was announced, we thought that it would apply to each child, the increase. But in actual fact, it was miscommunication by the government and a lot of fumbling. It actually only applies to each caregiver. And the preliminary analysis that has been done on that demonstrates that that is severely lacking in what is actually needed in order to provide children with sufficient access to food over this period while schools are closed. And what we are looking at is a significant number of children that are projected to be in extreme poverty as a result of these lockdown measures and the failure to have adequate assistance put in place. A number of organizations, including my own, have been advocating for the resumption of the school feeding programs in some form, at least. There have been some concerns around social distancing, but there are examples of how that has been able to be achieved. But there has been resistance to this from the Department of Education. Quite frankly, we don't quite understand why it is that this cannot happen, and we're continuing to advocate for this. final issue that I want to highlight is touching on the point that Zuki raised, which was around sanitation and access to water and toilets, and specifically in schools. Now, it is actually one of the most shameful realities that in South Africa, there are still many children who attend schools that don't have access to adequate water, and they have dangerous structures as toilets, if they have proper toilets at all. And there has been advocacy and court challenges over the years to compel government to fix this issue, but the progress has been excruciatingly slow and shamefully, again, to some resistance by government. So the government itself has now identified 3,500 schools across the country which require emergency water provisioning. There's a question mark around the accuracy of that figure. It possibly is more than that. But there's a lot of skepticism about government's ability to actually achieve this, given the fact that there's been such a slow progress over the past 25 years. And as Zuki pointed out, there's some real concerns around the procurement, the budgeting, the irregular expenditure. We know that when these sorts of circumstances arise, there's rife opportunity for corruption. And so this is something that we're quite concerned about as well. At the moment, it seems that the department will only open schools that have adequate water, toilets, hand sanitizer, and masks. But if government goes that route, this will likely leave rural and poor township schools behind. So again, there's that existing inequalities that are likely to deepen as a result of the pandemic. So I'll hold off on there, and hopefully we can engage more in the question and answer session.
That was absolutely fascinating. And once again, I'm so struck at the similarities. All the issues that you've raised, Nurina, are issues that we've also been concerned about in India. I suspect at even worse levels of inequality and desperation. So we've already received a whole number of questions for all of you. And I'm going to just list them out in a round because they're all divided amongst you. And so maybe if you could just note down which ones you would feel like answering. There's one that is actually asking about Africa as a whole. And there's this whole perception that, Sub-Saharan Africa will be relatively safe from the COVID crisis because of the fact that there are so far few cases and so on. But then, of course, there are problems about inadequate data of birth and death records and low levels of testing. So one question is, how reliable are these numbers? And is it really safe to say that a lot of Sub-Saharan Africa doesn't really have to worry about the crisis in the same way, or COVID in the same way? To Nurina, there is a question about the legal framework, which is not really about your presentation, but I guess because you're a lawyer, that could you please share the disaster management legal framework and its effectiveness in South Africa? Because in some countries, for example, I know even in India, there's been criticism that our National Disaster Management Act has allowed for very significant centralization of authority away from the state governments to the center, and it's being misused rather than actively used in a positive way. But is that the experience in South Africa as well? To Fiona, Africa is a major exporter of primary products whose prices have fallen very sharply now. Do you think that this will actually necessitate a stronger transition towards industrialization? Well, we can always hope, I guess. But to Zukiswa, there's a question about the large slums in Johannesburg and elsewhere, which are also common in many other developing countries, and what the situation is there. Is there a sort of significant spread of COVID infections in these dense habitations? And what has been the impact on livelihoods of workers who live in these settlements? So the issue is to look at both the lockdown effects as well as the containment effects. And of course, we know that the disease itself is much more easily spread, as you mentioned, in slum settlements where you cannot do social distancing and where you don't have access to water and all of those things. So several of you mentioned food, and there's a question about the status of self-sufficiency of food in South Africa. How important is trade in food, both import and export? And has COVID-19 hampered food security? You already mentioned that a little bit, Nurina, in terms of the schools, and we have that issue as well, of children who will not access it. But what about the aggregate food security or food sovereignty, if you like, as in general? There's another general question about, and I think Gilad, this is also directed to you. COVID has brought to the fore, both Ebola and COVID have brought to the fore the lack of pharmaceutical capacity and the lack of public health systems in Africa. Has the crisis triggered any pressure on the governments to invest in health systems? I mean, it ought to, right? It seems obvious that it would, but has it actually done so? I'm actually struck in all of your presentations at this similarity, and I'm wondering whether I can also ask a little bit about the, there's another question about the deaths due to distress caused by lockdown, due to stigma, due to hunger. And so what's the kind of evidence of that? For example, Vikas, who has been managing this series of lectures, has been compiling data in India on the deaths due to lockdown. And those are also rising very rapidly. Those are in excess of 300 at the moment, which are coming out of various, things: hunger, loss of employment, loss of livelihood, depression, distress, attempting to go back home by migrants who were then killed on the road or die on the road, and all kinds of other terrible forms. Yes, a final question I want to ask to both of you, but I guess also, just a broader macroeconomic issue, that how come all these emerging markets are responding? These are supposedly democratic governments. They should be responding to popular pressure. It is so evident that what you have to do now is to spend. And many countries across the world are doing just that. They are actually putting on fairly large fiscal packages. Gilad has told us that the South African fiscal package wasn't so large after all. In India, we've just announced a very large one which doesn't have any fiscal element in it. So what is it about the nature of political economy today that these governments in these emerging market countries seem unwilling to respond to the needs of their citizens, probably out of fear of the financial sector? Is that what is going on, or what is it that is actually preventing them from doing what seems to be obvious and what so many other governments across the world are doing? So should we go in the reverse order now? Maybe I can begin with Nurina and we go the other way. Go ahead, Nurina.
Okay, well, it's an interesting question in terms of the legal framework. So we have something called the Disaster Management Act, and that has been the primary legal regulatory instrument. Under that act, there are structures that are set up which are meant to kick into place or get triggered when a national disaster is declared. And one of the very controversial things at the moment is that the government has set up a structure called the National Command Council. And that structure is not actually contemplated by the legislation, but it seems as if that structure has quite a significant decision-making authority. The government has come back in response to challenges around that and said that the structure is merely advisory in nature. But the concern has been that the National Command Council, which is made up primarily of ministers, the executive, is really driving the decision-making. And what we've seen over the past 2 months is a plethora of regulations and directions almost on a daily basis, changing on a daily basis, none of which is going through the legislature, and only one of which that I'm aware of has actually had public participation. And so there's a real threat and growing concern that our democratic foundations are being undermined through effectively rule by executive regulation. And one of the very concerning aspects of that is that these regulations are actually criminalizing conduct. And so what we have is criminal offenses being made without any legislative oversight, without any public participation, and it's being done on a very ad hoc manner and in many ways, or in many circumstances, without any real public health justification. So we've had criminalization of very minor, petty type of conduct for breaching the lockdown regulations. And that's creating a real difficulty now in respect of poor and vulnerable people being arrested, being harassed by the police for not wearing a mask outside, or for simply being in their yard, because that's being interpreted as a breach of the regulations. And so I think there is a lot of similarity in respect of the fact that the legal framework is supposed to be implemented in a particular way, but given the urgencies and given the crisis, there's been a lot of, I think, I don't want to say exploited, but there's been an overuse of particular instruments and not enough legislative oversight. And I know that there are a couple of coalitions and organizations, including my own, that have been picking up on certain of those issues.
Thanks, Nurina. Do you want to take up the issue of food as well, or shall we get Zukiswa to answer that?
Only just to say that in addition to the school children that I mentioned, where there is this problem of, and one professor, Professor Madhi, has recently said that for the first time in one of the hospitals in Soweto, they're getting cases of children who are suffering from severe undernourishment. And so this is not theoretical, it's a real issue that's affecting children across the country. But in addition to school children, there's the issue of children who would normally have been in early childhood development centers. And in respect of those children, they would have been received in some way through the ECD center, some form of subsidized nutrition, but that has also been halted. And so that's also a severe concern.
Thanks so much, Nurina. And I see that Zukiswa has already shared a slide on the food matters. So Zukiswa, will you go ahead? Yes.
Yeah, I just thought to quickly touch on the context of informal settlements, and in particular, and the food issue is a significant one. Several organizations have looked at that, and you know, for example, in the coalition that both Nurina and Gilad also contribute to, there's been quite a concerted effort to track the responses to food security and responses, particularly in households that are already vulnerable, and households whose breadwinners have lost their sources of income and livelihoods. And so there's another study by the Human Sciences Research Council, which looked at 19,000 respondents, which I think is quite something, within such a short space of time. And seeing really that many residents in informal settlements, in township, in township communities, and in general, have no money to buy food in the current lockdown context. And so there's a lot of human rights concerns in that respect. There's also issues of access to chronic medications and less accessibility, again, in the context of lockdown. And I don't have to tell you about our public transport system and the challenges there for many. And so that adds yet another layer in terms of access and accessibility. So maybe just lastly, in response to the question about informal settlements and transmission rates, I'm not an epidemiologist, nor am I someone who's been looking at those infection and transmission rates. But at this point, it would seem that the rates of infection, at least as reported, isn't what one would expect, but I think there are there's reasons for the outliers, and there's reasons for why the situation isn't as grave as we would think. But the pressures that people are under to go and find food and to rescue their livelihoods are incredible. And so the current the victory, as it were, in terms of keeping the transmission rates low, I think there is some bubbling under in terms of the realities and what may well happen in the context if we don't succeed in making sure that people's livelihoods are protected, that people are able to have access to sustainable food. So I think it's dangerous to in any way celebrate that our transmission rates are what they are, or could be worse, and so on, given the context.
Wow, thank you, Zukiswa. Yes, the similarities keep coming, and I guess not just South Africa and India, but very, very many developing countries. And that brings me to mind that unfortunately I left out a very important question, which I will ask Fiona and Gilad also to address. And maybe then Zukiswa and Nurina can come in if you also have some thoughts on this, because it's a very broad question. What do you think can be the path for economic recovery in the post-COVID world? Big one out there, so putting it out there, you can think about it meanwhile. But Fiona, do you want to start respond to some of the questions?
Sure. Let me take one or two. First of all, just to comment very briefly on this issue which has come up. Nurina also commented on it, of kind of governing through executive regulation and so on. Obviously, I'm unlike her, I'm not a lawyer by training. I mean, personally, I don't have a problem with use of executive regulations in a disaster because of the need for speedy responses and speedy changes. We cannot wait for weeks for things to be put into place legislatively in order to mitigate the spread. But having said that, I mean, I think that obviously it's important that these regulations pass the test of rationality, that the content of them is justified in terms of what is trying to be achieved, that they can be reviewed by democratically elected representatives and can be amended as needed. I think it's just interesting when we compare the experience of a country like China with ourselves and others. Obviously, it's a completely different kind of society, a different kind of political economy, and so on. China has had a lot of success in containing the epidemic. If you look at even at its peak or in total as a proportion of China's population. And the success in it not spreading geographically and so on. It's not something that can be replicated in other countries in that way. But there are trade-offs in terms of not implementing things firmly and losing lives because of that. I think where we go wrong in terms of this particular issue is an overemphasis on kind of the pettiness of some regulations, and very unnecessary, heavy-handed responses. People being shot and killed and so on for petty infractions. It's a complex issue. We could talk more about it. Then I just wanted to speak to the issue of the effects on Africa, which was one of the questions which had come out. I think unfortunately, in my view, it is likely to still hit African countries quite extensively. It's just quite a delayed hitting. So I was looking, for example, at some of the recent data. This is from the same data source that I put up those charts earlier, which is looking at which are the countries in which infections are rising the fastest in the world. Obviously, there's different ways of measuring it, but this is one source. And topping the list is Zambia. It's basically a list of low-income countries. Zambia, Nepal, Yemen, other African countries, Benin, South Sudan, Chad, Gabon, Sudan, Guinea-Bissau, and so on. So they're from a very low base in terms of the level of infections, but do seem to be rising fast. And I think will be very difficult to contain the spread medically due to the social conditions, weak states in many cases, inability to implement testing, tracking, treatment, and so on, and of course the poor healthcare in those countries. So, although in some ways globalization takes a different form in these different countries, but I think we must be prepared that it will spread there, and the economic effects are already being felt in those countries, even where the medical transmission has been slower, in terms of capital outflows. A reduction of capital inflows, domestic capital flights. So even though, as we know, the US is the worst in the world in terms of coronavirus, but still the dollar is a safe haven as always. The terms of trade shock to commodity exporters, the loss from remittances from workers abroad, particularly in cases like Zimbabwe, which are very dependent on this, declining tourism, fallen exports, and so on. So I think economically, the shock will be very heavy for low and middle income countries. There was a related question about whether this could perhaps spur a move towards industrialization, deriving from the loss of primary commodity exports. Yeah, I think probably not. I think industrialization takes more, obviously, than a loss of export markets in terms of primary commodities. And in many cases, the industrial base in low-income African countries is so weak that there's very little even to build on and to upscale. There might be some opportunities, for example, where supply chains have been disrupted, and maybe imports from China have been disrupted. There might be some opportunities where there's clothing production and so on to substitute some of that, and perhaps from there, to build up a little bit of a manufacturing capacity. I suppose another avenue, if we're looking for potential opportunities, would be where countries upscale their domestic production of personal protective equipment, of producing basic, not necessarily ventilators, but things like masks and gowns and so on. Perhaps domestic production of that could provide a bit of a springboard, but I wouldn't see a kind of wholesale industrialization arising out of this.
Great, thank you, Fiona. Okay, Gilad, up to you now.
Excellent, thanks, Jayati. So on a few of these, I think that it's on the sort of Africa-wide developing countries issue. As you yourself have said, I think we face even larger risks than we faced in 2008. Commodity prices, they increased post 2008. There was like a few year a bump. That's probably unlikely now. In private public, like leverage levels are higher now than before the 2007, 2008 crisis. Global trade and investment, including in tourism, is going to be impacted for months, if not years. Healthcare financing is not generally a part of counter-cyclical measures, and as Jati has written about, the scale of capital outflows has been enormous. So on all of those levels, that's not so much a response on a public health and the potential impact in terms of infections, but I think in terms of the economic impact, we'll see. It is devastating. On the issue of livelihoods, I'm just going to share a quick graph here. South Africa's informal economy is smaller than in many other countries, but still obviously plays an important role. And what I'm showing here is extreme poverty below the food poverty lines for households with informal sector workers, right? And we see that the blue line is for what the levels were at, and that maroony line was based on the initial 3-week lockdown. And we see, for instance, that we've effectively had, beyond the closure of the formal sector, in which, of course, there are wage support mechanisms in place, we had a total closure of the informal sector. And we can see that you see an almost 3-fold increase in extreme poverty for households with informal sector workers. the green and yellow bars are about what would happen if we implemented various social grant measures. You know, there's no doubt that there's been a significant loss of livelihoods, both through formal and informal sector worker channels. And, you know, that's been mentioned by Zuki and others in terms of the surveys. Unfortunately, the quarterly labor force survey we don't have yet. Also, the government or statistics like South Africa no longer releases income data on a quarterly level. So it's difficult statistically to know the income implications. On food security, you know, South Africa is not self-sufficient, but the issue in South Africa at the moment is not food shortages, it is food distribution and food access, right? With some of us having access to wonderful food and others without income. The production of food on a subsistence level by households is lower in South Africa than in some developing countries. So the closure of informal sector food systems is both negatively impactful to those who sell it, but also restricts access, and it plays a very important role in the low-cost acquisition of foods, in particular of vegetables and other perishables. You know, one would think that this is a time for the pharmaceutical sector, industrialization measures, healthcare. And again, this is one of the things which has been illustrative of this contradiction in South African economic policy making, where there have been calls for that. There has been some financing, there has been some support for that. At the same time, various lockdown regulations made that hard, right? At the same time, the amount of fiscal subsidies is insufficient. So, you know, other countries like in Senegal have actually done remarkably well in a reorientation of certain industries, and South Africa had more to do there. The last two points are on how come, and Jayati, you know, this is the answer to which I'm sure you have very nuanced answers. I would say two things. The first is, if one wanted to take a generous interpretation to why the fiscal measures have been weak, in South Africa, for instance, there is a borrowing cost which is significantly higher than in Europe. In advanced countries, you can borrow at almost 0% interest, right? That's not true here. And so the most sympathetic case can be argued is that the fiscal limits are more significant, okay? Now, of course, that excludes domestic resources, taxation, things like SDRs, through the IMF, forced bond buying by the institutional investors at concessional rates, Reserve Bank, and so on. So I don't think it's a valid excuse on a whole. And I think it reflects, at least in South Africa, a deep internalization of economic orthodoxies, which we certainly haven't shared in terms of sort of Washington consensus orientated mindsets, and it reflects the structural power of the financial sector here and of financial sector agencies like rating agencies. And it's an almost pathological adherence to these economic mores and economic orthodoxies by those which are in power, and interestingly enough, less so by those that are in business. The business people know that they need state intervention now. They need rescue, right? It's actually state ideologues who have held that line most firmly. The last point is on a pathway for economic recovery. Now, obviously, we don't have time now, nor necessarily everything worked out to sort of lay that pathway open. But what I think that as progressives, this has to be a moment which we attempt to utilize in that way. And I think it points to a way in which we have to conceptualize crises as interrelated and systemic. This, as many have argued, is a precursor for the ecological crisis, which is looming. And what we need to do, I think, is tie the links between those various crises and the various deficiencies in a global capitalist like system, and understand how those are systemically interlinked, see how this provides avenues for dislodging the economic orthodoxies which underpin that, and how that can, in an integrated global way, offer new policy avenues.
Wow, Gilad, thank you so much for that really impressive and wonderful last statement. I don't know if any of you wants to add to that, but I really do agree with you. And I think, yes, you captured it in terms of the political economy that we are all facing, and the colonization of the mind, I think, among our policymakers, which persists despite all kinds of things that indicate to the contrary. You know, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I have learned so much, and I have to say a lot of it has been a little depressing, because I somehow thought that South Africa was going to be so much better than India in terms of the response and all of that. And it is still a lot better, but it's not as much better as I thought. And I think it points precisely to the point that what you were saying at the end, that there is this overall overweening control of the neoliberal ideology, which is pervading our politics, and the class orientation of the state doesn't help in that respect either. But I want to then just end on the wonderful point that you made at the end, that we can't let the current political economy constrain us. And I think just drawing on what you said, it's very clear that when this is over, it's going to be a different world anyway. It's going to be a very different world, whether capitalism wants it to be or not. And so that's our chance, really, to at least have the alternative position out there for people to think about and grasp. And maybe the political economy also then changes. So I really want to thank all of you. This has been such a wonderful discussion. And it's been great to listen to you. And I'm so happy that you could all spare the time and come and tell us about all of these things. So thanks so much.